Thanks everybody. Today I'm giving a talk called Growing Big in Small Spaces 2. I gave a different lightning talk about 4 years ago, so I'm going to update on that story and talk about the directions I've been going since then. So the first part is the Ames Community Garden. And so in 2016, I was in grad school in Ames, and I got a couple plots in the Squaw Creek, now the Iowa Creek Community Garden. So you can see my plot is the one that's full of trees. There's a whole story behind that. And so when I joined, I observed the vicious cycle going on, where people would till their plot, it would become filled with annual weeds, they would abandon it, and they would start over the next year. So our solution was to use permanent beds, deep mulch walkways, a focus on diversity and perennials, and managing chiefly for light. So this is my friend Aaron Rosenberg and I setting out sort of a grid system with roughly 6x6 beds with a few exceptions just to fit the space. When we implemented it, we got a lot of compost and laid it out. This is myself, my friend David, and you can see the garden is starting to come into fruition. By the end of the first year, we used a lot of annual crops like sunflowers and various vining crops to get some biomass. Over the years, this is a couple years later, you can see the fruit trees are starting to come in, the walkways are starting to become more developed, a lot of greenery. Fairly early, May 21st, and you can see that the garden is already in full succession. Later in 2021, this is June 8th, you can see it's starting to resemble some sort of forest. You can see a peach tree and various other tree crops with still walkways. There's the whole seasonality around the garden, and so in the winter, this is I guess the end of the winter, April 22nd, you can see walkways and a fully developed root system. The map evolved over time, and I connected several beds. The dark green is what I like to call the meadow, where I grew more of my annual crops, and then the little circles all represent various trees and bushes. I designed around a keystone element where the fruit trees were the most important keystone, just like a bridge holding the system together, and then they're supported by a variety of herbaceous perennial and berry crops. A key system to this, with growing so many trees in such a small space, is a chop and drop. So my excess growth became chopped off and laid on the ground as my fundamental fertility engine in the garden, and also just to keep things open. I grew an incredible diversity of berries. It's sort of a laboratory space for me. So currants and honeyberries and raspberries and strawberries. Basically any berry that you can grow in this climate, I tried to grow to various degrees of success. Everything really besides blueberries was quite successful. I also grew a huge variety of herbaceous perennial crops. So you can see horseradish and garlic chives, walking onions, asparagus. My wife's holding some rhubarb. And vines. So we grew Apis americana, grapes, groundnut, Chinese yam. I will say this is by far the hardest element in a small space is to keep vines under control. So potential for enormous production, but also incredibly hard to manage. I also tried to introduce diversity with a variety of prairie plants. You see some blazing star, wild indigo, bergamot, several others. And I actually did produce some food. So you can see some peach production, pears, cucumbers, annual crops, plums. It is a fairly productive garden space. And I personally love bugs. So I saw a huge variety of insects that I'd never seen before, thread-waisted wasps, various caterpillars and butterflies, tortoise shell beetles. I asked the Iowa State Extension for a lot of these. But a huge variety of life in such a small space. And vertebrate life, you can see a variety of wildlife, and actually my cat Squeaky, and several other animals. In 2022, I moved away from Ames, and so I managed the garden for a couple years at distance in Iowa City and then in Davenport, which was hard. You can see basically the garden would overgrow, and then I would come and it would look like this with pokeweed and everything growing to the middle, and I would, as much as I could for a few hours, chop and drop and bring the system back under some semblance of control. Until my friend Nick Sisler and his wife Beth took over the garden, and so since then they've been managing it, and it's continued to thrive and evolve to this day. So what have I taken from there? I used the logic of growing big in small spaces to grow bigger in even smaller spaces. And so this is my apartment in Iowa City. You can see I took over a north-facing deck and took over the parking spot in front of the house, and growing a huge variety of my fruit and nut trees in a really small space, including the garage. And so I built a little, it's a completely legitimate, but a little garage garden where I would start my plants, and I started playing around with some aquatic invertebrates. So these are Daphne magna. I have a couple other species, but using the nutrition of the fish water to feed the aquatic invertebrate life, to feed back to the fish, and then to feed the water ultimately to the plants as a source of nutrition. We moved last year to Davenport, and so this is the backyard of my house. And the day we signed the mortgage, I put a couple of beds in. I've been trying to grow big in this small space and in the basement. So this is the updated version of the garage garden. And I grew several hundred tomato plants, a lot of peppers, and a huge variety of other things. A lot of stories going into this, including at some point I released lacewings larvae, and it didn't work that well, but I found a lot of things in this basement. And I actually had a lot of vegetable production. So with those tomato plants, this was each one of those an average harvest day through most of last summer. At this house, I'm also trying to develop a micro nursery. So in the fall, I put my pots in the ground. You can see some of the state forest nursery plantings that I peeled in. Those are some pawpaw plants. And I'm using this as a base to grow small in big spaces. So my parents bought a 50-acre property south of Des Moines a couple years ago. You can see my car shuttling plants around the state. The top ones are actually from Redford Farm, and then the bottom ones are ones I planted. It's an interesting property where about 4/5 of it are forested on about a 100-foot drop from right to left. And then there's an old field, so just like sort of an abandoned cropland field with incredibly depleted soil, but also a lot of opportunity for improvement. And so there's really high quality endemic forest. In the bottom left is actually a small portion of the neighbor's property where you can see the trees that were not high graded. The rest of my parents' property was high graded about 20 years ago, so a lot of the best trees were taken out, but there's still incredible spring ephemeral diversity. So things like dwarf larkspur and a variety of other plants. Some of the best spring ephemeral diversity I've seen in the state. And including ramps and Szechuan pepper, or the prickly ash, the North American version of Szechuan pepper. So some opportunity for forest gardening in the future. I also added a couple honeybee hives just to list this as a protected honeybee space to try to give some protection from aerial spraying. So see, hopefully that works. And there's an incredibly difference in the soil quality on the site. So in what I call the low ground meadow, there's incredibly rich, dark black soil, and my chestnut trees are proportionally much taller, about 200% taller than the ones in the upper field. But I'm also much more careful because there's such rich biology in this area of the property. In the old field, you see a lot of incredibly depleted subsoil clay that I've been working on micro swirls. And my tree plantings there, I've been trying to incorporate small landscape convolutions to capture rainwater and let it sink in to help my dad not have to drive around and try to water all my trees in the property. We've been focusing mostly on chestnuts, persimmons, pawpaws, cherries, plums, apples, and a lot more than that. And I've been using largely tree tubes. I've experimented some with wire cages. There's advantages and disadvantages, but I do think the tree tubes ultimately are the most effective at getting the plants above browse height with the least amount of input, because the cages are really tough. I don't know if anybody's used them and get all cut up. I've also been working on establishing a market garden. So on the left is the first year I was establishing it with some occultation and then some compost addition. I have a rod fork, and so I've been using that to kind of decompact the soil and build basically micro swales on contour. You can see on the left is just a handful of soil from that market garden, and there's some roots and some hyphae and a little bit of the compost being brought into the soil, but overall quite depleted, very compacted, low infiltration rate, but a high water holding capacity, so a lot of opportunity for improvement. On the property, I've also been digging some hand-dug swales. So here's a little pond in sort of a small catchment area. In the forest, there's incredible pitting just from decades of mismanagement. And so my goal is to capture the water in a high area of the property and then work my way down the slope. So thanks, I've had a lot of help from my friends and family, including my friend Meshi here. And then I have a new daughter, Hazel, so a little hazelnut there. And so I've definitely tried to bring things like my bachelor party and then just host little different festivals. And so it's a great way to bring friends. I have great friends, so they're willing to come out and help. And it's been invaluable. And so in future directions, this is an ongoing project. I'm trying to plant more trees, add more gardens, add more water capture, try to reduce a lot of the multiflora rows and invasives in the forest. And then this year I've actually got some freedom rangers, so we'll run some pasture broilers for the first time. And hopefully eventually the forest needs goats, but I still live in Davenport, and so my parents are not quite ready for that. But a lot of directions at the farm, and this is what I've been working on. So thank you for listening.
We can take one question for me while I just transfer the PowerPoints over, if anyone has a quick question. No? Okay, yeah.
When are you moving back? Because that's not going to happen unless you're like in Indianola.
Yeah, so probably about a year and a half.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, Margaret, you're ready to. Margaret and Margaret.